In 1637, a ship slipped quietly out of Kinsale Harbor on the southern coast of Ireland. On board were 61 men and women, Irish men and women, being transported against their will to the Caribbean island of Barbados to work as forced laborers on sugar plantations. By the time the ship arrived, 8 of the 61 had died. The rest were sold for sugar. That was the first ship. It was not the last. Over the next 2 decades, tens of thousands of Irish people, prisoners of war, orphans, the landless poor swept up in Cromwell's campaigns, were shipped to Barbados, Montserrat, St. Kitts, and Antigua. On those same islands, at the same time, enslaved Africans were arriving by the hundreds of thousands, torn from the kingdoms of West Africa, sold at the same markets, and worked in the same fields. 2 populations, both displaced by the same empire on the same patches of ground. And over the generations that followed, their DNA mixed through violence, through proximity, through survival, and in rare cases through something that looked almost like choice. 300 years later, scientists compared Black American DNA to Irish DNA, and the connection they found encoded in those genomes was bigger, older, and more specific than anyone expected. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and hit subscribe. To understand the full picture, you have to start somewhere that most people never start. You have to start with what Ireland actually is, genetically speaking. Most people think of the Irish as a fairly homogeneous population. Celtic, Northwestern European, pasty, stubborn, and ancient. And in some respects, that picture is accurate. But the genetic history of Ireland is far more layered, far more dramatic, and far more ancient than the simple Celtic story suggests. The Irish DNA story starts not with shamrocks and stone walls, but with farming villages in what is now Turkey. And it ends, thousands of years later, in a Caribbean sugar field, shoulder to shoulder with enslaved Africans from the Niger Delta. In 2015, researchers from Trinity College Dublin published a groundbreaking study in the journal PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They sequenced the first whole genomes from prehistoric Irish individuals. What they found rewrote the origin story of the Irish people entirely. The oldest Irish genome in the study came from a Neolithic woman buried at a megalithic tomb, a passage grave, dating to between 3,343 BCE and 3,020 BCE. Her genome showed predominantly Near Eastern ancestry. She was not Celtic in any sense that modern people would recognize. Her people had migrated to Ireland from what is now Turkey and the Middle East, the same wave of early farmers who spread agriculture across Europe thousands of years ago. They built Newgrange. They built the Great Passage tombs. They shaped Ireland for over 1,000 years. And then, genetically speaking, they almost vanished. Then around 2000 to 2500 BC, everything changed. 3 Bronze Age individuals from Rathlin Island, a small island off the northeast coast of Ireland, showed a completely different genetic signature. Their genomes carried substantial ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grassland region stretching from modern Ukraine to Kazakhstan. These were descendants of the Yamnaya people, the Bronze Age herders who swept across Europe from the east, carried with them horses, metal, and new languages, and replaced earlier populations in a series of migrations so dramatic that geneticists describe it as one of the most complete population turnovers in European prehistory. In just a few generations, the Y chromosome haplogroups of the men who had built the megalithic tombs were almost entirely replaced. Those Bronze Age Rathlin Island individuals also carried the genetic variants for blue eyes and lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk as adults that are today considered quintessentially Irish traits. They carried the Y chromosome haplogroup R1b, which now accounts for over 80% of Irish male lineages, making Ireland the most R1b dominant country on Earth. In the far west of the island, in Connaught and Munster, that figure climbs toward 100%. What this means is that the modern Irish people are themselves the descendants of a collision between ancient Near Eastern farmers and Bronze Age steppe migrants. The DNA that today we call Irish is the product of a population replacement that happened 4,000 years ago and left the original inhabitants of the island almost genetically invisible in the modern record. The Irish, in other words, know something about having their genetic story overwritten by forces beyond their control. They know what it means to carry an identity that was shaped not by choice but by conquest. And that is only the beginning of the connection. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, subscribe right now. We cover the genetic stories that get buried under the official version of history. This is one of the most buried stories we've ever told. Subscribe. Now let's go deeper. Let's fast forward to the 17th century, because this is where the Irish and Black American stories stop running parallel and start running together, literally, on the same patches of sugar-soaked Caribbean ground. In 1649, Oliver Cromwell, the English military commander who had seized power after the English Civil War, launched a brutal campaign of conquest across Ireland. His armies massacred Catholic Irish communities at Drogheda and Wexford. They confiscated Irish land on a scale that amounted to ethnic displacement. And they did something else, something that has been largely erased from the mainstream telling of both Irish and Black American history. They shipped Irish people, men, women, and children to the Caribbean as forced laborers. Between 1652 and 1657, Cromwell's forces rounded up tens of thousands of Irish men, women, and children and transported them to Barbados, Montserrat, St. Kitts, Antigua, and other Caribbean islands. Estimates of the total numbers vary. Historians put the figure somewhere between 50,000 and 130,000, representing as much as 4 to 15% of Ireland's total population at the time. These were not volunteers. These were prisoners of war, vagrants swept up in military campaigns, homeless orphans of Cromwell's scorched earth policy, and Irish Catholics who had supported the monarchy and were therefore political enemies of the new republic. By 1655, approximately 12,000 Irish prisoners of war were working on plantations in Barbados, representing close to half the white population of the island. On Montserrat, Irish settlers were so numerous that by the 1630s, up to 70% of the white population was Irish. Now, on those same islands, on those same plantations, were enslaved Africans. Hundreds of thousands of them were captured from the kingdoms and coastal communities of West and West Central Africa, shipped across the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships, and put to work in the same sugar fields side by side with Irish men and women who had themselves been transported against their will. This is the moment. This is the origin point of the genetic link between Black Americans and the Irish. And it is a moment that neither the American historical memory nor the Irish historical memory has chosen to fully examine. Let's be precise about what happened and what didn't, because this story has been badly distorted in both directions. First, what history clearly shows, Irish indentured servants and transported Irish laborers were not the same as African chattel slaves. This distinction matters enormously and must be stated plainly. African enslaved people in the Americas were chattel, legal property, without rights, without any fixed term of service, without legal personhood. Their condition was permanent, inheritable, and rebus-based, codified in legal frameworks like the Barbados Slave Code of 1661 that explicitly defined slavery along racial lines. Irish indentured servants, however brutal their conditions were, had legal standing. They had a fixed period of service, typically 7 years. They were not property in perpetuity. Their children were not automatically enslaved. The Irish experience in the Caribbean was brutal and should not be minimized. But conflating it with African chattel slavery is historically wrong, and historians have been clear on this point. What history also clearly shows, the Irish and enslaved Africans on these islands lived in proximity. They worked in proximity. They had children together, not as equals. The social hierarchy of these plantations was rigid and violent, but the biological record of that proximity is real, and it is measurable in DNA. The Catoctin Furnace study, published in the journal Science in 2023 by a team from the Smithsonian, Harvard, and 23andMe, found something that crystallized this connection in hard genetic data. when researchers extracted ancient DNA from the remains of 27 enslaved black individuals who lived and worked at a Maryland ironworks between 1774 and 1850. They found that many of the Catoctin individuals carried European ancestry, and that this European ancestry came predominantly from Britain and Ireland, overwhelmingly on the paternal side. Think about what that means. These were enslaved people buried without names in the soil of 18th century Maryland. Their maternal lines, their mitochondrial DNA, traced back to West Africa, to the Wolof and Mandinka of Senegambia, to the Congo people of Central Africa. Their paternal lines, their Y chromosomes, carried the genetic signatures of Britain and Ireland. The Harvard team was explicit about what this represents. It aligns, they said, with known histories of sexual exploitation of enslaved people by their enslavers and others in positions of power. Irish men, overseers, plantation managers, and laborers who had worked their way out of indenture and into positions of authority were among those whose genetic signatures now appear in the DNA of Black Americans. They are there because of violence and coercion, not because of love or choice, but they are there. The DNA is unambiguous. Now here's where the comparison between modern Black American DNA and modern Irish DNA reveals something that nobody put in the history books. The 23andMe study by Bryce and colleagues from 2015, which analyzed the genomes of over 5,000 self-identified African Americans, established that the average Black American genome is approximately 73 to 77% West and West Central African in ancestry. The remaining portion is primarily European. What the study also showed is that this European ancestry is not evenly distributed among European populations. The largest single European contributor to Black American DNA is the British and Irish genetic cluster, the Northwestern European Atlantic Ancestry Group, carrying the R1b haplogroup lineages that, as we have established, are most concentrated in Ireland. This is not a coincidence. It is a direct genetic record of which European populations were most heavily involved in American slavery, as slave owners, as overseers, as plantation managers, as men who lived in proximity to enslaved women and left their biological signature in the genomes of the children those women were forced to carry. The Irish were not the largest group of slave owners in America. That distinction belongs to English-descended Americans. But the Irish were, in disproportionate numbers, present at the ground level of the plantation economy, as overseers in the South, as day laborers in close daily contact with enslaved communities, as immigrants in New Orleans, in Charleston, and Baltimore, who occupied the social tier just above Black Americans and whose proximity left a measurable biological mark. Research published by the Irish Diaspora Histories Network documents case after case of Irish surnames appearing in the paternal genetic ancestry of Black American families. A 1938 South Carolina record names John Cabean, an Irish overseer on a plantation, as the father of a child with an enslaved woman named Charity. Edward Ball's landmark book Slaves in the Family, which traced his Irish-American family's 167 years as slaveholders in South Carolina, during which they enslaved nearly 4,000 African Americans, brought this dimension of the story to wide attention and revealed that many of those enslaved families carry Ball family DNA in their genomes to this day. One genealogy researcher put it plainly: it can be estimated that Black Americans have as much Irish ancestry as many white Americans who claim European heritage. The Irish thread in Black American DNA is not a footnote. It is a structural part of the genome. But there is a dimension to this story that goes beyond the plantation, beyond the Caribbean sugar fields, beyond the Y chromosome signatures of Irish overseers in South Carolina. There is a cultural dimension that DNA science is now helping us see more clearly, and it runs through one of the most fascinating and least discussed chapters in American social history. In New Orleans, in the early 19th century, researchers have documented a system called placage, an extra-legal arrangement operating just beneath the surface of official society in which free women of color were placed under the social and financial protection of white men. Many of those men were Irish immigrants, arriving in the port city in enormous numbers in the 1810s, the 1820s, and the 1830s, fleeing poverty and famine in Ireland, landing in the most cosmopolitan city in North America, and finding themselves living in neighborhoods alongside free black communities in ways that were unusual anywhere else in the country. The arithmetic of survival in antebellum New Orleans was brutal and bizarre. Black American men in the city had a life expectancy of approximately 14 years, ground down by brutal labor, disease, and violence. Irish American men living in the disease-ridden port city fared barely better, surviving to an average of 31, but Black American women had an average life expectancy of 36, longer than Irish women, who averaged only 18 years, decimated by poverty, childbirth, and cholera. Out of the brutal arithmetic of survival, these communities form families. 3 and 4 generations of intermarriage and cohabitation produced a population in New Orleans whose DNA is now recognizable to genetic ancestry companies as a distinct and traceable blend of West African, Irish, and French lineage, the genetic fingerprint of a community that America's racial categories never had adequate language to describe. Montserrat took this blending further and made it permanent. Today, the island's population, which is of predominantly African descent, carries Irish surnames, celebrates St. Patrick's Day as a national holiday, and preserves in its accent the faint but unmistakable echo of 17th century County Cork. Linguists who have studied the Montserrat dialect have noted specific phonological features, vowel shifts, intonation patterns, the lilt in certain syllables that appear nowhere else in the Caribbean, but bear resemblance to the Munster Irish speech patterns of the people who were transported there 3.5 centuries ago. It is not a perfect match. 400 years of separation, creolization, and cultural blending have transformed it. But it is there, in the voice, in the name, in the flag with the harp. In 1768, on St. Patrick's Day itself, a group of enslaved Africans on Montserrat rose in rebellion against their masters. They chose that date deliberately because the Irish plantation owners and overseers would be drunk and distracted by their own celebrations. The irony of that moment, of enslaved Africans using the Irish national holiday as cover for their own fight for freedom, is itself a perfect capsule of the entire 300-year relationship between these two communities. Shared suffering, shared space, adjacent oppression, and a shared genetic record that neither official Irish history nor official American history ever chose to fully acknowledge. So what does the DNA comparison ultimately tell us? What is the full picture when you lay Black American ancestry data alongside Irish genetic data and let the numbers speak? It tells us that modern Black American DNA carries, embedded within its European component, a measurable and historically traceable signature that goes directly to the Irish genetic cluster, the R1b haplogroup lineages that define Irish paternal ancestry across 4,000 years of recorded history. It tells us that this signal entered the Black American genome through the same mechanism that put all European DNA into Black American genomes. The sexual violence and coercion of slavery concentrated most heavily in the plantation economies of the Caribbean and the American South, where Irish men were disproportionately present. It tells us that the Irish and African peoples share a history on Caribbean soil that predates the American Republic, that was produced by the same British colonial machine that subjugated both populations, and that left a biological trace in both communities that 300 years of official history chose not to examine. And it tells us something else, something that the ancient DNA from Rathlin Island and the Bronze Age genome data adds to this picture. The Irish themselves are a people whose genetic identity was overwritten by migration, displacement, and population replacement. The original inhabitants of Ireland, the Neolithic farmers who built the passage tombs and who lived on the island for thousands of years, were largely replaced by Bronze Age steppe migrants, who brought with them the R1b haplogroup and the genetic traits we now call Irish. The Irish know in their bones what it means to have your ancient identity buried under someone else's narrative of who you are. That knowledge, even if it has never been consciously articulated in genetic terms, is part of what makes the Irish and Black American connection more than just a story about shared European admixture in an African American genome. It is a story about two populations who were both defined, controlled, and exploited by the same imperial system, who were both told that their histories began when that system chose to record them, and whose DNA now tells a far older, far more complicated, far more human story than any of the official versions ever did. The bones don't lie, the genome doesn't forget, and the connection between Black American ancestry and Irish ancestry is not a coincidence, not a footnote, and not a myth. It is written in the double helix. It is measurable, specific, and real, and it has been sitting there in the data for anyone willing to look. If this video changed how you see either of these histories, share it, drop a comment, subscribe now so you don't miss it.